Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. So today we do have Anna Bayly-Bruneel to talk about a very important topic. And Anne, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being today with us. It's an honor to have you. We're delighted to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Heatham. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. This topic is really dear to my heart in terms of the intersections of trauma, compassion, and collective healing. And so I feel really honored to be here. And I wanted to say thank you to Wafa Dawood, who actually also invited me to speak here today. So thank you, Wafa. My name is Anne Bayly-Bruneel, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am a person who identifies as cisgendered, heterosexual, female-identified person. I mention that because one of the things that we're talking about in this presentation is around intersections and intersectionality and the importance of that. I'm very committed to my own healing practice and very aware of intergenerational and systemic trauma and the replications of how that affects us individually and collectively. I come from a working middle-class family, and I'm the third born child in a family of four. And I am very much calling deeply from my heart in terms of speaking today. So you will know that I'm calling in from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Ottawandan, and the Lenape peoples. And I'm speaking about the intersections of trauma, compassion, and collective healing. I've had the privilege and the challenge of working both in individual settings, in hospital settings, in community agencies, as well as in private practice. And so I've had the opportunity of journeying alongside many folks who are experiencing trauma. And I'm wanting to talk a little bit about the flow for today. So next. So I thought for today, what we could do is to start with a meditation, just a simple grounding practice. I'm very aware that the topic of trauma and the intersections of trauma, compassion, and collective healing is a very tender topic for all of us these days, and in very different ways. And so I just invite us all just to take a moment and allow yourself to just get comfortable in your seat. And just take a moment and let yourself feel your feet. And just notice how your feet are relating to the ground where you're sitting. And allow your whole body and being just to feel the support of the chair that you're sitting on. And take a moment and just welcome in all parts of you, any sensations, any thoughts, any experiences, and just greeting yourself with whatever degree of compassion and curiosity that's available to you at this time and in this moment. And if it helps, you can even imagine having support on either side of you, to your right side, to your left side. And just taking a moment and feeling into your whole being and body, connecting in with your heart. And just take a moment in holding space with each other, noticing who's here. Thank you. Next. So for today, we're going to share from our own experiences and really come from a place of listening deeply, listening to understand, having an open heart and a beginner's mind, sharing a willingness to learn and to unlearn, and to be able to locate ourselves and have self-inquiry. And giving opportunity for us to collaborate, create, to imagine what's possible in our collective healing efforts. Next. So around the topic of intersectionality, we want to recognize that intersectionality is a lens through which we can see where power comes in and collides, and where it locks and where it intersects. And it's the acknowledgement that we all have our own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. And this is an image that was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, and you can just notice the areas of intersectionality around race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, religion, ability, sexuality, mental health, age, education, and attractiveness, and many, many more. And so how that looks in our world is, in terms of, for myself, being someone who is white and cisgendered, I have privilege in some areas in my life. And being a female identified person, I have less privilege in some areas in my life. And so it's just this awareness that when we're interacting, when we're meeting, when we're connecting with each other, that we begin to bring that kind of sensitivity and awareness to who's in front of us, to the life stories, to the heart stories, to the soul experiences. And recognizing how the systems in which we live in also creates intersections of who has power and who has privilege, of who is disadvantaged, who is more marginalized. These are the intersections that we want to be aware of when we're talking about trauma and coming from a place of compassion. Next. Next. So this is just a way in which we can conceptualize the different layers of oppression. You can see the outcomes and the impacts of oppression in this tree. And we can look at the ideologies and some of the institutions that contribute and that instruct some of the oppressive forces that we experience. And you can see at the bottom some of the roots around white supremacy, patriarchy, colonization, capitalism, different caste systems. And the more we become aware of how we're all steeped in different forms of oppression, the more we can come from a more liberated consciousness in support of ourselves and others. Next. So I really find this graphic incredibly helpful in terms of looking at how it's all connected, and that you can see how racism, white supremacy, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, misogyny, colonization, environmental terrorism, all of that is interconnected. And one of the core themes within that is violence. That's kind of, excuse me, the center. And violence being about dominance, about being power over, about really non-collaborative ways in which we interact with each other. And this presentation is really about looking at how do we do this differently? What are the possibilities and how we can engage in a more empowering conversation where we can be courageous in what we say and speak in terms of helping to create more solidarity movements. This is also really tapping into the importance around choice, the importance around self-determination. Next. So we often hear the word trauma, and there's lots of ways in which we can understand trauma. And one of the ways in which trauma is understood is around the events, the different ways in which we experience events in our lives, whether that's a pandemic that we've all had experience having our lives touched by in ways, or whether that's the experiences of intimate partner violence, whether that's the experience of systemic oppression. And when we look at trauma from the lens of the event, one of the pieces I feel that's really missed is around trauma not being just about the what happens. It's also about what's happening inside of us as a result of what happens. It's also related to how we experience our trauma as a result of the things that never got to happen, or not having empathic witnesses to support the renegotiation of trauma. And so I think it's a very complex term, and we use it a lot to describe our experiences. And it's so important that we come from a place of being trauma informed and trauma responsive, and recognizing that all of us, in many ways, have been touched to some degree by trauma, self-included, and that the behaviors and the responses of ours is coming from the ways in which we've had to adapt and the ways in which we've had to survive overwhelming and difficult experiences. And so that lends us to having more sensitivity. It lends us to having a more curiosity and coming from a place where we're not assuming that we know what another person's experience is. So we can really lean in and listen deeply to what is actually connecting to the trauma, and what is connecting to the experience of ourselves or another person that we're meeting. Next. So for me, when it comes to talking about mental health and addictions, I feel like we need to broaden the conversation. I think we need to continuously challenge the ways in which things are conceptualized or pathologized or stigmatized. And I really love this image. I'm sure many of you have seen it. And what it really speaks to is how, we have this, the beginning layer around the medical model. And then we have the ways in which, especially Western Eurocentric culture, creates a lot of individualism. And then we have this pathologizing around the DSM in terms of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. But underneath all of that lies the other pieces of awareness around the intersections and how, the social determinants of health and well-being are very much connected to how we respond and engage in our world. Because trauma is actually the disconnection of our relationship with ourselves. And when we're disconnected from ourselves, we're also disconnected from other people. So if you look at, discrimination, adverse childhood experiences, inequality, violence, xenophobia, we start to get to the root of what might be underneath a symptom. What might that symptom be trying to communicate around what the injustices have been? We're looking at mass injustices that have been happening, for centuries and continue to happen in, this day and age. We just have to look at our neighboring country to see the different ways in which power and control are being used in ways that are taking away human rights, that are taking away the right to bodily autonomy, the right to, live in a culture of belonging as opposed to have to fit into a particular way of being that's not actually self-selected. And when we start to see that when we're experiencing injustices, we have strong reactions and responses naturally because we need to. That's also a part of how we survive. That's how we engage and adapt. And so for me, there's a lot of importance around creating space for feeling and for us to be able to feel in order to be able to heal. And so it's really about centering lived experience and creating these collaborative and inclusive communities that are really trauma responsive and healing engaging, creating spaces that are anti-oppressive and anti-racist, creating experiential models, really amplifying voices of BIPOC people and healing practices that have been deeply, deeply rooted for, a long, long time. And that, certainly in terms of, some of the models of care that we have are very westernized. And I think there's this real need to start to imagine what's possible around experiential models of care, somatic based therapies, and I'll touch into some of this a little bit more. And really allowing ourselves to be curious and not to assume, and holding space with compassion. So I just really wanted to point out ACEs. So this is the experiences of adverse childhood experiences, which can happen both in our homes, it can happen in our communities, and it can happen in terms of environment. And when we leave ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, unattended and unaddressed, it can create a lot of toxic stress. And this toxic stress has a ripple effect in homes, in children and families, in communities, in systems, and organizations. And if you look at this in terms of, many people have experienced divorce or have experienced physical or emotional neglect or emotional and sexual abuse. And the ACEs really help us to understand how these experiences affect a person over the trajectory of our lives. You can look at kind of the roots, at the bottom in terms of community, when we're talking about poverty, when we're talking about substandard wages. You can see that there's like cyclical intergenerational traumas that happen across lineages and across families as a result of these social determinants of health. And then we look at, in terms of the environment and different ways in which our environment also contributes to our well-being or has an adverse effect on our well-being, and how do we mitigate that? Next. So adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing, I would say our world today, really. And I've had the absolute privilege and pleasure of supporting my own journey through, healing adverse childhood experiences, as well as supporting other people. And I find that we don't talk about this enough. We don't talk about, the impacts of abuse. We don't talk about emotional neglect. We don't really speak a lot about what are some of the challenges that, individuals and families are navigating on a regular basis. And, as a result, there's a real increase in depression, anxiety, and substance use, because we're all just trying to find our way and find different ways of coping and adapting in a culture that doesn't really recognize the importance of feeling and community and collective responses for healing and well-being. And so if you look at the stats, 1 out of 8 of the population has more than 4 ACEs, and 67% of the population has at least 1 ACE. And ACE again, there was a number of questions that were asked related to the themes around abuse, household challenges, and neglect. And that was kind of the summary that came from that. And if you look at the different ways in which ACE affects neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, it contributes to disease, disability, to social problems, and also early death. In some people with 6 plus ACEs actually are at risk of early death. Next. So I wanted to really spend some time to talk about what happens underneath in terms of the nervous system responses. How does our body experience trauma? How do we experience this in terms of our own fight, flight, and freeze responses, which are related to trauma? And so you can look at when we're in more of a sympathetic state, we feel more frustration, we feel more irritation and anger and rage. And there's this real need for self-protection when we're in a fight response. And we can also oscillate to a flight response, which is when we feel more panic, fear, anxiety, worry, or concern. And we can move between these physiological states. And when we're in deep, deep overwhelm, we experience freeze. And freeze is known by feeling more numb, feeling more dissociated, sometimes shamed, sense of helplessness or hopelessness. And so just kind of noticing that some of the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we're responding with one another can sometimes be related to these trauma responses that we're having or that we're experiencing. And when we're in more of a social engaged place, we tend to be more in what's called ventral vagal, where we feel much more relaxed. We feel more at peace. We can tend to be more open and curious and engaging, and feel more grounded in ourselves. And that allows for more of a sense of embodied peace. And so it's just being able to notice, how your own nervous system is experiencing moment to moment connection, or what's happening to my nervous system when I'm hearing about some of the global, concerns or crises that are happening. How am I to engage directly in solidarity movements when I might feel overwhelmed? So it's being able to kind of recognize our own capacities and the importance of, really deepening our own inquiry around what's happening in our nervous system and our bodies. Next. So I find this graphic really helpful to look at just a little bit more in terms of, when we're in a trauma response like a fawning, this tends to be a time or a way in which we might people please, we might avoid conflict, we might tend to prioritize other people's needs or have, difficulty setting boundaries. And when we're in flight, we might experience more anxiety, more panic. We might want to avoid things or engage in more chronic perfectionism. And you can just kind of look at like freeze and fight just in terms of the different ways in which that can show up. So our trauma responses are not our personality. And we do know that in terms of our physiology, that our story follows state. So what that means is if I'm in a calm and more regulated place, if I feel a deeper sense of safety and curiosity, then I might see things in a different way than if I'm in a fight response. If I'm in a fight response, I might feel that I need to protect and defend and control things. So I just find it a useful way of supporting us to have a deeper understanding of what happens in communication. Next. So this is a beautiful diagram around the impacts of trauma in terms of creating sometimes split off or disconnected or fragmented parts of ourselves. And what that really refers to is that, if you grow up feeling that it's not okay to feel your feelings, then the only thing that you might do is you might have to exile some of those emotions. So we can have exiled parts of us that can hold a lot of deep wounds and deep pain and deep shame. And we can have protective parts of us that show up more as these managers or these firefighters, which are deeply invested in, not wanting to get hurt again. So managers are parts that like to keep the person feeling secure. They tend to want to control people, events, or other parts. And they bear this huge burden of responsibility for trying to keep life together. And they're very afraid of relinquishing control because they don't want to get hurt again. And so I find it really helpful when connecting with folks to really get to know the protectors, because these protective parts of the self are here for a reason. And we all have different ways in which we protect ourselves, thank goodness. And they are really deeply important parts to get to know and to get to understand the function of how they show up in our lives. Firefighters tend to be the parts of our nervous systems or our patterns, our adaptations that tend to be more about trying to stop us from, experiencing anything at all. So they can take on more extreme behaviors. And the self is the part of us that we can really have compassion and a deeper appreciation for how we've adapted, how we've survived, how we've come to know ourselves, how we exist within the, the micro and macro communities that we intersect with. And the qualities of self from the lens of internal family systems is really around experiencing more courage, feeling more confident and connected, having more compassion, creativity, clarity, and calmness. And there's something really beautiful when we can come to ourselves with this deeper place of self-energy, holding all of our parts. And when we are able to do that, which I would say is a practice and, it's not anything to perfect, but it's just this practice of being able to hold your whole self with a deeper level of embodied compassion. Next. So essentially, our healing is part of collective liberation. And what this really refers to is the more that I take care of myself, the more I'm able to show up in a different way for people in my life, in my personal life, in my professional life, and that self-care is actually community care, that the two are actually interconnected and interwoven together. And, in terms of working alongside folks in a role of being a psychotherapist, it's a deep privilege every day to be able to support people to become more deeply connected to themselves and to grow in their capacity to love and appreciate themselves and to live the life that they want to live, and feel more deeply invested in their own desires and passions and purpose. And so that's a real gift, I think, in terms of what can happen when we come into deeper contact with ourselves, is that healing is exponential and infinite. Next. So when we're talking about self-care and what that means, we can see this kind of as a yin-yang. And Kristen Neff had created this yin-yang of self-compassion, which I think is really beautiful in terms of we can comfort ourselves, we can soothe ourselves, and we can validate ourselves. And we all have different ways of doing that. And the other side of that is that we can really engage in protecting human rights, providing, motivating, assisting in solidarity movements, assisting in, creating a more just and equitable society for all. Next. And this is an image that just kind of extends that, which is around fierce self-compassion. So having both the tender self-compassion where we accept ourselves to help alleviate our own suffering, where there's a balance between this inner healing, which is tender and caring for self, self-validation, self-reassurance, but then also fierce self-compassion, which is really taking action and being able to have the capacity to oscillate between both, I think creates, this term, which I love, which is called a caring force. The more that we can care deeply for ourselves, we have more capacity to broaden that caring force outward. Next. So this is just another way of describing self-compassion, really around when we're experiencing, struggles or difficulties, that we can be mindful, we can recognize when we might be stressed or struggling, and really attend to ourselves without judgment or any kind of self-shaming. And we can also engage in self-kindness. We can be really supportive and understanding when we're going through something really difficult. And I think we've all, in many different ways, we've all had a difficult experience in the last few years around the pandemic and just the global crises that continue to happen. And so being able to tend to ourselves and have a matrix of support in whatever way that can be, can also be very helpful. And it's just recognizing, our common humanity, that we're not alone, that we all experience difficulties, we all experience mistakes. There are different ways in which we can show up for ourselves, which is an awareness that everybody goes through difficulties at some point in their life. And we can move in a direction of more understanding and a deeper sense of understanding, and feel more, compassionate towards our experiences. Next. So I love this quote from Thomas Hubel, which is really about adequate cultural healing and peace building requires us the ability to gain a precise and comprehensive picture of what is happening, and to really globally socially witness is the ability to feel and relate to our cultural and intersectional processes that are happening. And in some ways, that's really connected to our capacity to see, the different ways in which systems of oppression impact individual and collective trauma, how that's all woven together, and how we can reimagine different ways to create structures of power that's more about power with as opposed to power over, that's collaborative, that creates more choice, that supports more social justice, movements, really. Next. And so this image really just kind of speaks to that, which is, the reality that we currently live in, that's very troubling, is that there's some that are getting more than what's needed, while there's others that get less. And that equality is this assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports. You can see in that picture that still doesn't actually create equity, which is that, recognizing the individual needs for support, and how justice is about removing whatever barriers are actually in the way of creating a society and a system where everybody gets to play and engage equally. Next. So trauma for me is often about grief, and collective trauma represents collective grief. And for me, what that means is just recognizing the deep, deep sorrow, the despair that's connected to some of the unmet needs, from earlier experiences, or connecting to the pain around, harm and injustices, and allowing ourselves to be touched by and to feel the pain of ourselves and others. And that can actually be a doorway to love. And this quote, in terms of, if grief can be a doorway to love, then let us all weep for the world that we're breaking apart, so we can love it back to wholeness again. And I truly believe that grief creates, it creates a bit of a portal when you can allow yourself to feel your own sorrow or your own suffering. We have a deeper level of capacity for empathy and compassion for others. And so embodiment actually supports us to be in more connection with ourselves and not just live from our head. It's like a whole being wholeness, which supports a deeper way of relating and connecting to self and others. Next. Yeah, so within any experience of, trauma, there's also this life force. I look at this image of this plant that's kind of breaking through this concrete, like that life force and that vitality is there. And often it's about, how do we create the right conditions of support and care and attunement and validation to support that little plant to grow as big as it knows it can be. And so coherence is learning how to notice what's happening underneath, what's happening underneath the symptoms or the responses, and listening for the life force, listening to where is there regulation, where is there calm, where is there movements towards peace and solidarity. So we bring our attention to that, and where our energy goes, that's also what tends to grow. So this is really speaking about connection and openness, harmony, empathy, receptivity, feeling more engaged, feeling this deep, deep sense of compassion and emergence in what's possible. Next. Next. So I bring this slide in, and this is some of the work that's been done by Systems Sanctuary, which is Rachel Sinha and Tatiana Fraser. And what they've been doing together, which I think is just beautiful work, and I just really want to amplify that in terms of system changing perspectives, is looking at, how feminist practice brings this kind of power analysis, what's missing in terms of looking at, breaking down binaries and seeing intersectionality. And system change really brings love by looking at the wondrous interconnectivity of our relationships between our human and non-human world. It invites us into recognizing that our healing really has an impact on how we support and heal and create healthier systems, both within ourselves in terms of our own system, as well as in the larger, and invites us to hold complexity and nuance. So we move out of these polarizing ways of thinking and seeing things, and hold this complexity and nuance and broader ways of growing and learning and re-envisioning. And it really invites us into a way in which we can locate ourselves, where we can find ourselves, where we can work across differences, where we can have communication that feels more expressive and holistic and creative. Next. And this is just another diagram that really speaks to how we can center lived experience, that services and systems that really center the lived experience of people who are accessing the services are going to meet their needs better. And naming what are the meta systems that are interfering, impacting, or supporting what's happening. And being able to shift the power, shifting from ways in which we lead in terms of these dominant hierarchical structures to more of a system that's actually about servant leadership, about collaboration, about networks, about collectivism. And that we can learn and adapt, and we have enough flexibility within our own selves that we know how to do that. Next. And this really is about the principles of healing engagement. And this work, which I also want to amplify, comes from the Praxis Project. And it's really speaking to that healing-centered engagement is actually political, explicitly political, rather than just clinical. And that it's about culturally grounding and viewing healing as actually the restoration of our identity as humans, and starting to look at the strength-based, when we connect with ourselves and we connect with others, like noticing the strengths, like what's right about who you are, how you're showing up in the world, and looking at, that we heal in relationship. So as a psychotherapist, I engage in my own healing practices so that I can show up and support people in more deeper ways to support their healing. So it's more about ebb and flow and recognizing that interconnectivity and that interdependence. Separation is one of the greatest illusions, and it leads to a lot of suffering. And we can have boundaries that can be responsive and flexible to what's needed. Next. And so liberated relationships are one of the ways in which we can actually create abundant justice. And it's an understanding that there's enough attention and care, resource and connection for all of us to access belonging, to be in our dignity, and to be safe in community. This is a beautiful quote by Adrienne Murray Brown, and she does a lot of amazing work on pleasure activism, that we can actually bring joy into movements around solidarity, that we can bring our life force to support collective healing, and that we can continue to engage in really compassionately responsive ways of being that supports us all to create and reimagine a new world together. Like we can actually architect a new world together. And I believe that it's deeply possible. And I see and know the ripple effects of what's possible through the work that I feel really grateful to be able to do. And I'm here to support this widening perspective for myself and for others. So thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity to share and to speak with all of you. I must say, like, connecting with Zoom is such a different way of engaging because it's hard to, feel the energy in the room, but I do feel your presence, and I'm so grateful and appreciative. And there is a rights and responsibility awareness initiative feedback form. I'd welcome you to fill that out. I'm just going to put that in the chat. And if you have any questions, oh, go ahead. And if you have any questions at all, I believe, Heatham, you were sharing that could be put in the chat.
Yes, please feel free to type your question on the chat, or if you would like, we can let people unmute themselves so they can just ask ahead. So whatever you prefer. So if is there any questions? So if there
Anyone
if there is any question, please feel free to type it into the chat. We will be delighted to answer it. And well, in case of no questions, I would like to thank you very much, Anne, for this wonderful, fruitful, and informative presentation. Thank you very much. It has been an honor to have you here. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. We are looking forward to see you in another sessions. Stay safe, stay well, and happy Canada Day and long weekend to everyone.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor to be here with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.